Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you for joining the Word and Duende District's Margins bookselling event, celebrating the book Magical Realism by Vanessa Angélica Villarreal. My name is Michelle, and I'm your host for today's event. If you're new to our programs here, the Word is a nonprofit organization whose mission is storytelling for collective abundance. We center authentic storytelling for BIPOC, LGBTQIA2S+, neurodiverse, and disabled communities, support and connect writers, publishers, booksellers, and readers, explore and build collective models for the literary ecosystem, and hold safe space in community. Our main programs include the Editor-Writer Mentorship. Applications are open now. The Margins Literary Conference and Book Festival, which is taking place online September 9th through the 14th, and in person in Denver, September 21st and the 22nd, and Margins Bookselling, which includes the BIPOC Bookseller Award. Nominations also open. Got a lot of things going on over here. We always have new events and programming to share, so we hope you'll check out thewordfordiversity.org to stay up to date and connected. Tonight's event is a part of our Margins Bookselling program, which celebrates booksellers and bookstores centering the communities that the Word serves, and we support over 200 booksellers. The celebration includes our Duende Word BIPOC Bookseller Award and the month-long celebration in July, so happening now, to amplify the bookstores in our network and to help build reader discovery. It also includes an interactive bookstore map featuring nearly 200 bookstores owned and are managed by the communities we served, curated author events like this one, bookseller curated reading lists and recommendations, community-centered workshops and education sessions, and opportunities for economic and professional development. So definitely check out our website to learn more about the program and all the different things that we have going on right now, which is a lot. Now for our guests of honor this evening. Angela María Spring is a poet, journalist, and the owner of Duende District, a bookstore sin fronteras for and by people of color, where all are welcome. She holds an MFA from Sarah Lawrence College, and you can find their recent work in the Slowdown, a public space, the Washington Review of Books, Catapult, LitHub, and Tor.com. Her poetry collection, DESMADRE Poems, is forthcoming from Flowersong Press. She will be in discussion with our great guest tonight, Vanessa Angélica Villarreal, who was born in the Rio Grande Valley to Mexican immigrants. She is the author of Beast Meridian, who received a Whitting Award, a Kate Tufts Discovery Award nomination, and the Texas Institute of Letters John A. Robertson Award. She was a 2021 National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, the Paris Review, and elsewhere. She lives in Los Angeles with her son. Please join me in welcoming Vanessa and Angela to the room. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Michelle is so dear to my heart. She's a close friend, but also just always doing amazing work. And I'm so happy to be reunited with the Word. It's been a while. So, bienvenidos, mi gente. So much love and gratitude to our partners, the Word, who we've been working on this phenomenal virtual event series for a few years now. I'm Angela María Spring, and I'm the owner of Duende District. And just a couple more things about what we do. We have a couple current, very small partnered bookstores with Early Eves Cafe, which has a location in Albuquerque, which is where I am, and also a location in Brooklyn. So you can technically find us in both places. We had our last DC pop-up boutique has gone away, and I am sad because DC was where Duende was born. But maybe we'll have another one again. And then, so for those of you who are new to our bookstore story, the cornerstone of the Duende Project is about the collective, the community, and the creation of decolonized literary spaces that center and celebrate Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I just want to have a quick update. We've been on an event hiatus in our stores, running at minimal operations for the past year or so, and probably a little more into the future as I focus on my little one who is autistic and needs me to be as present with him as much as possible right now. But I am so delighted to be here and to reunite with the Word for the most, I'm gonna fangirl so hard. So I'm gonna just nerd out here. Yeah, I have wanted to do. So Vanessa, we've hosted Vanessa before because you were in conversation with Juan Felipe Herrera, which was really wonderful. And I hated that I could not personally introduce you. So this is like making up for that. And also, I know we had like some technical difficulties during that one. So crossing our fingers that everything will be good here. But yeah, so let's see. I have been thinking about this book that you wrote ever since you started like dropping hints about it on social media. And I'm like, oh my God. Well, first of all, if you guys don't know, Vanessa's first poetry collection is on the Decolonize Your Mind Duende list. Like if that is our like canon, that's the Duende canon. This book is obviously going on the Duende canon, but it has been there since I created that list on Bookshop. Like your poetry is so formative for me, for so many other, like just contemporary poets and writers, and now the new book, Magical Realism, is it's an answer to questions that I have had these past few years, and I have been trying to figure out how to write about, and you did it. You did it, and I was like, fuck, I'm never going to write anything that's not in conversation with this book because you answered the questions, and I was just like, oh my God. Anyway, so I told you I was going to fangirl. So yeah, honestly, I couldn't even prepare myself for how much magical realism has blown the doors off my imagination, let alone the concept of imagination itself. The book defies shape and genre, though technically people will call it an interconnected personal and critical essay collection or something woefully inadequate. But through her lens as a Latina eldest daughter of immigrants in the Rio Grande Valley, tracing the erased and suppressed history of her family, as well as mining the deep wells of her own experiences growing up as an adolescent in the 1990s, she asked the questions I know many of us within the diaspora have been seeking answers to for years. How do we recover our familial, ancestral, and collective memories? What tools do we have at our fingers when language itself has been co-opted and transformed by our colonizers, when we adopt the language of our colonizers, when even that language is losing meaning with the advent of AI? When silence is all our family has to offer, the storytellers must speak in the language of poetry and connect us back to true resistance, which is our imaginations, beyond the oppressive borders of capitalism, a spiritual disease, a devouring system that is our greatest enemy. Magical realism is benediction and reclamation. It is the question and the answer and a new question. It is a wound breaking open and healing in the earth itself. It is an offering from a poet who has pushed beyond pain and betrayal and fear to uncover her beating heart that grows ever larger until one day it will contain us all. So Vanessa, I am so excited to be in conversation with you tonight. I do want to say before we begin, we are taking audience questions. I know Michelle is going to monitor the chat. I'll monitor the chat too. So if you've got questions, go ahead and drop them, and we will get to them as much as we possibly can. And yeah, here we go. How you feeling?
Incredible. I'm speechless. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's all I have right now.
I'll let you process that.
I can just like talk forever, but yeah, that was.
I know. I want to show people, this is the book. So it's beautiful. Look at it. Yeah. Love it. Buy it. Oh shoot, I've got a link to buy it. let me drop that in the chat. My apologies. Let me find it. I mean, technically you could go to our bookshop page. You go to duendedistrict.com and hit the shop link. It's like the first book that pops up in our underneath our Decolonize Your Mind list. But let me dig that up somewhere. Or maybe Michelle can dig it up for me. She knows what to do. And she'll drop that link in the chat. So yes, please buy this book, this gorgeous, gorgeous book full of all of the things. I think I don't know about you, Vanessa, but I'm 1 year older than you are. And I grew up in Albuquerque, and you were in Texas. And so it so much of what you're writing about is both parallel to my life as like a weirdo. It was like growing up in Albuquerque as like a Panamanian Puerto Rican is a weird thing because nobody knows what, like literally they're like, what are you? and we don't understand. Plus I look very white. So it's just, so there were like total parallels, but then there were like it was like also peeking into so many of my own classmates' lives in a lot of ways, growing up. So, but the things that stuck with you were very much the things that stuck with me growing up. And I've never seen that before. I feel like you're writing for a generation of us. We're like in this weird, like we're right after Gen X, right? We're like elder millennials. And the 90s were such a weird ass time. And you're defining it through, I think, one of the things that we ended up defining it through, which is music. And the musicians that, I mean, your essay on Kurt Cobain and Selena was just like, yep, that was it. That was like, if you were, Latin in like Texas, New Mexico, like Arizona, like any of these places, and you were a weirdo like us, because not everybody was a weirdo like us, we were like kind of caught in all of these liminal places. Those were the two major figures. And so I'm really grateful. I was really grateful to like experience that. All right, I've given you enough time to process, and now I'm going to make you like, I'm just going to tell you how much I love everything you wrote. Yeah, so I'm going to say first, how have you been sitting with your book out there in the world? It's obviously such a labor of your heart and of yourself. Have you even had time to begin processing everything?
That is a great question. So this is what I ended up submitting as my dissertation. And so this came out on May 14th, and I defended my dissertation on May 27th. And, just select like the more critical essays in the book. And after that, I just like shut down. Like my body just like, I had no control over it. I just had to like lay down for a moment. I've been a PhD for 8 years, so I've been like thinking and writing toward this book pretty much since the release of Beast Meridian. As I say in the book, on my publication day for Beast Meridian, that's the day my husband ended our marriage. And so the life of a writer, the only life of a writer that I know is one of grief and processing. As I released my book, my life completely fell apart. I lost my marriage, my house. We just bought a house. We were in it not even a month, and I lost it. And from a place of security into total precarity. And so, I think I remember this unboxing photo that he took after he ended the marriage. And I'm like unboxing Beast Meridian, and like, unboxing videos are supposed to be this like joyous, like, and all I could feel was like heartbreak, rupture, panic. And so the release of magical realism, it is such like a happy, wonderful thing. But I have this memory of the release of my first book. So I did kind of just like, also I was like working toward my dissertation defense, and I was just like, I need to lay down. So, but now that things are going to ramp up, I'm just going to take the summer to just like process the closing of that like huge chapter. And yeah, but it has been great. I talked to Kyle Carrero Lopez with the Poetry Project. The interview is online. That was a great interview. I just did another interview with the Southern Review of Books. Both of them are unhinged. Everything I say is unhinged. I did an Instagram live with Hip Latina, even more unhinged. And it was, it's been great.
I'm so glad. And I hope it's just, I hope you're able to give yourself that space and that time to really live in the moment of this book, because I totally hear you about having the shadow of the previous, public. I mean, I guess it's all about, doorways. Also, felicidades on defending your dissertation. That is amazing. Huge congratulations. Like, that is joining the ranks of so few Latina people who have their PhDs. Something I've always been very aware of, because my mom got her PhD in the 70s and was almost not given it because there was a racist dude. One of the people on the board was from Alabama, and he just didn't think that a Latina should have a PhD, and she had to fight him, and so like that battle is yours too. And I hope you own it, because that you are a warrior and you're doing it. And I know, like, people like my mom, they wanted people like you to be able to do it as they were doing it. So bask in it. Also, that's so fucked up of your ex. I better never meet him for so many reasons.
Yeah. Like, I'm just like, you know what? He set me free. So that's, yeah. But
that's true. It's like, what is it? The best revenge is a life lived well. Like, I get it though. It's like, oh yeah, let's talk about it. It's not always cathartic to write out these experiences, but sometimes it can be. What was that process for you, writing out that trauma, of your marriage and an abusive partner and everything that he did? Was it helpful?
So that's actually like a big hurdle I had to overcome in the writing, because I didn't feel like I could write a divorce memoir. I just didn't feel that anyone would care about my story. And so every story I told about myself, I already expect not to be read, not to be believed, to be discredited, to be just ignored. And so how do I make the circumstances of my divorce, which were, they just had elements that were like related to race and disability and, class and things like that. How can I make myself visible to the world? And so I think like the only way I could really access writing about the divorce was through the lens of something else. And so in, the case of the book, it appears in a lot of different ways, but through The Witcher, right, is how I told kind of the story of healing from the divorce, through the lens of music, through the lens of gender, through the lens of wolves, right? Mm-hmm. That's how I'm able to access it. Also, in the writing of the book, I think like at the beginning stages of it, the critic who I love Parul Segal, I believe that's Parul Segal, wrote this piece for the New Yorker entitled "Against the Trauma Plot," or like, something along those lines. I quote it in the book. And, she was kind of identifying this glut of traumatic backstories for characters in fiction, as well as just like as a theme. And she was like really longing for mystery, characters who had mystery about them. So she cited Virginia Woolf, Sula by Toni Morrison, characters who hold back on their story, and it makes you kind of like wonder what their past was and how she longs for that sort of confidence in fiction, because now fiction and our stories in general tend to be very self-conscious. And so like you have to, in order to have a bad guy, in order to have an antagonist, you have to give your antagonist a trauma plot, a traumatic backstory, in order to justify his actions, right, to humanize him. And I completely see her point. I agree with a lot of it, but at the same time, and she identifies PTSD, like the rise in PTSD, diagnoses and like the popularity of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is a very problematic book. And, you know, we're just kind of living in a traumatic time. So maybe like this is how we're dealing with it. And I think like that's where I had my break with the argument of that article, because I don't think it's just that PTSD is popular now, like a popular diagnosis or like a more prevalent diagnosis. I really think we're experiencing a break in reality and how we process reality, very similar to what happened during like the modernism era. This like shift from, you know, one type of labor, manual labor, to mechanized labor. War being fought to where like you can see your enemy in front of you and you're stabbing him or shooting him or whatever on the battlefield, to not being able to see your enemy at all because of technological warfare, right? Which is actually what I argue Lord of the Rings is about, right? Like this shift from, you know, a world that we understand to this like technological world. And so the center of the world, or what we understood to be the center of reality, right? Like W.B. Yeats has that famous poem, "The Center Cannot Hold." That's the condition of modernism, right? During, like, let me kind of back up. During modernism, God was dead. People were losing faith in the church. People were leaving family homes, generational homes, moving to the city. People were living in apartments. There was just like this like huge cultural change, and the Industrial Revolution, right, just like completely reframed reality. And so we started experiencing changes in our art, right? Like art started becoming a lot more conceptual. The, you know, deconstruction of literature itself, right? Reading texts, you're not just taking it at face value. Things like, you know, Hitler propaganda and stuff like made it so that you can't trust the text in front of you as credible. And so that kind of break in reality that happened in that era of modernism, I think we're experiencing now. And I think like that's why we're experiencing the fantasy moment, why like Naomi Klein just wrote Doppelganger, right? About like the mirror, this sort of like sense of two realities kind of happening, the way like, you know, your neighbor can experience a completely different reality if they are like MAGA Trump people, right? And so that break in reality is, it, to me, that is what trauma is. Trauma, I think, like in terms of language, in terms of narrative, it is the forceful intrusion of someone else's story. So whatever story you were telling yourself, whatever you thought your reality was, the forceful intrusion of someone else's story to where you can no longer believe in the story you're telling about yourself, that is trauma. And yeah, so I think like that's why we're having a fantasy moment, like a sort of surrealism moment, like Afro-surrealism, Atlanta, Nope, Get Out. And so I, you know, because I was so, I mean, I just want to say that like I was inspired by this article, both to agree with it and argue against it and deepen the argument. Because it's not like PTSD, to say like there's a rise in PTSD diagnoses, I think it's inherently very Western to think of PTSD as an individual diagnosis that is to be dealt with privately on your own, you know, with a therapist, and not communally, like in community with your family in public, right? And so it's not that there's a rise in PTSD diagnoses, it's that trauma now, I think, is asking to be evaluated as a collective experience, as a mass experience. So like COVID, right? Like that, our reality, that broke, you know, the story we were telling ourselves about whether our structures take care of us, whether we can take care of each other. So like, I wanted to look at trauma now, not as an individual thing, but as a structural thing, as a collective thing, and as an ongoing thing. It's not like, I feel like trauma becomes very like isolated as a story in the way that psychology treats it. But, if we look at like Palestine, we understand generational trauma as ongoing, right? There is no safe now where you can say post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like ongoing, constant, and likely to happen in the future. And that is the condition of being in late stage capitalism and living in this world, right, as any kind of marginal identity, right? But then you get into this problem of like, is identity as far as I want to go with it, right? Because like that obviously has its limitations as like a critical framework. And so, that's, the book is searching for something beyond that, right? Like beyond this way of thinking about the world that's so limited. So gosh, I hope I answered your question.
Yes. I mean, I love the way you frame trauma as an intrusion of someone else's reality on yours. And it's very accurate. And what you write about and what you were talking about is that collective susto, like that. And we have to experience, we are in the process of, I think especially since the events of October and Israel's genocide, and then also really starting to tune in on the genocide in Sudan, and everything that's happened with Haiti. Like, we are in collective grief, not just collective trauma. And I love that you write about, like, I actually have a whole question about that, and let me dig it up because I have a quote from you in your book that I think is so good. So when we're talking about grief, in relation to it, not even like, but collectively watching, like live streamed. We have all seen some of the most. I honestly, I know I'm a poet, but words fail me. The things that I have seen, and I know that that's the way with so many people. Like, when I open up Instagram, and I brace myself to see literally the worst thing I've ever seen. We're all experiencing that. And as you say, there's no post to it. It's a post to the Palestinian people. And there's no post to us who are, they're just, our hearts are with them. Those of us who have the courage to have our hearts be with them, right? There's no day that passes when I'm doing my daily benedictions in my tea that I don't say Palestine is free because it has to be free. And that's like that. So you've got the two things that are happening. And in your essay, The Fantasy of Healing, you write, I now see the difference between trauma and grief. Trauma is a fixation on what is lost, while grief is proof that love still lives. And I just think that is so important to think about. And I'm happy to see a kind of like collective discussion starting to go in that direction. Obviously, I feel like you were ahead of the curve in that. I think about like my own grief that continues to grow and possibly vast, but then I also think about how at the same time, my heart is also growing into that same vastness. And that's what you have to do. Like, one of the things that I've been saying since the beginning is that no matter how much it hurts, you have to keep your heart open. Like, that is what we have to do. Our hearts are what make us not just human, but that is what will save us. If we can grow into our hearts and then let our hearts expand, because, Michelle knows I'm constantly talking about like abundance and the theory of abundance, because abundance is the direct opposite of capitalism, because capitalism is all about scarcity. But there's no real scarcity. That is the trauma that capitalism puts on us. That's the reality that capitalism is like intruding on us. But everything is abundant. But the most abundant force in the universe is love, which you know, everybody's going to be like, oh, wow. Like as poets, we're not really supposed to write about love, right? Like that's the cliche thing. Don't write about love. It's like, you know, and it's just like bullshit. That's all there is. To me, evil is the absence of love, right? And we have to have, and there is nothing that we are not connected to, each other and everything. And so, you know, like I've learned a lot about my relationship to the heart and the body in similar ways that I've learned from my study of plants and herbalism. So I wonder, do you see this collective grief as a first step into the new world? Are we finally coming to a place where we stretch ourselves beyond the tyranny of comfort and into real change?
That's a great question. So, you know, when we think of fantasy, we think of escapism. Like, you know, that's where we go. Like cozy fantasy is like really big. But you know, something that I've been doing, the video game Baldur's Gate 3 released around the time the genocide started. And I just remember, you know, just like scrolling in, taking in all the images, trying to just feeling so powerless. And so I would play Baldur's Gate to kind of try to disconnect, but it was so present in Baldur's Gate 3. It was the story of like colonialism comes through Baldur's Gate 3. And like, you know, you find things in the world. So like, let's say you like find a wooden barrel and there might be like something good in it. So you go like check it for loot and there will be like a tomato in there. And it's like, okay, so if this is a reproduction of medieval Europe, pre-colonial, you know, medieval Europe, in a fantasy world, the tomato would not exist without colonialism. So that means that colonialism is part of that imaginary, right? And like, you know, like they have like, you know, if your party rests, you can feed them food. And one of the things that you can feed them is coffee. And it's like, okay, well, coffee.
Yeah.
And so like, and I think some people can really disconnect. Like they totally use fantasy to disconnect. Because when I've identified things like allegory in, you know, Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, people will be like, what the fuck is wrong with you? It's like medieval, whatever. Like it's not about Mexicans. It's not about, you know, indigenous people. But they completely are able to understand how it's an allegory for the War of the Roses, but they're not able to connect history itself as an allegory for today. And so like that's the critical step that I'm trying to take, right? Like even something like the War of the Roses is a historical, it's narrativized history, meaning that it has been told in such a way that it makes a great story and it valorizes the West, right? And narrativizing history implies excisions, implies silences, implies like a very particular way of telling history. So that's my critique of fantasy, right? But fantasy is also a way that I think we imagine radical futures and radical collective pasts. So like, you know, I've been using Baldur's Gate 3 as an example, but like all of your companions are pansexual. So you can romance any of your companions and you can romance them as any race, any gender. You can present as any race, any gender. You can customize even your genitals, right? But like what we know of medieval Europe, like that wouldn't have been scandalous, but it doesn't have like a name, right? And it wasn't queer. But the way Baldur's Gate 3 imagines relationships, relationality, and how that like radiates out into the politics of the world, that is like a radically optimistic way of imagining not only the future, right, which is like we want to like head toward a future where like gender doesn't hold like expectations for roles or sexualities, but we are also imagining a collective past. So like what I love about fantasy, so like it's a comfort, cozy thing for me, right? I love Neverending Story. I love Lord of the Rings, Willow, all of that stuff. It's just like the conventions of the genre appeal to me. But why do they appeal to me? Well, place in a pre-colonial world, nature that is unclaimed, and so I start thinking about how we look at the past, right? So I'm about to go on a little bit of a long tangent. So if you'll just
I'll just get settled in. I've got my tea.
So when we go to therapy, right? Let's say our problem is anxiety, depression, whatever. And the therapist starts asking you about your childhood, about your parents. And in order to heal yourself in the present, it requires you to reckon with stories from the past. And so the act of healing is an act of restoring, right? You are taking a story that you have told yourself about yourself for the longest time and reframing it. You're not changing it, you're not lying, but you maybe are able to see yourself with compassion, are able to like come back to your inner child and say, I believe you weren't wrong, things like that. So that restoring, what I think fantasy is a restoring of history in very much that same way, right? It's a reparative look at our disgusting, violent, horrible histories of domination, oppression, subjugation. And while the world is reproduced, right, there's also radical repair happening in that reproduction. And so fantasy allows us to create a collective past, and fandoms experience that past together. So like one of my favorite things about Game of Thrones being back is meme culture. And the best meme culture obviously comes from Black Twitter, right? Mm-hmm. And so through fantasy, right, for just like an hour every Sunday, we're liberated from this history of subjugation and enslavement. I mean, not really liberated from it, right? But like we enter this world where we are experiencing a collective past where, Valarians are on, they're just as royal as Targaryens, right? And that radical reframing of what is possible in a collective past, I think like that is something that is healing our present. I think that's why fantasy is so prevalent now, right? If we can go back and imagine a past that is radically reparative, it makes the future not so scary, right? Because we've already dealt with it in the past. One more tangent. So I was studying, so I have this essay. It did make it into the book, and I haven't pitched it because I'm too scared. Because I'm just afraid people are going to think I'm unhinged. But it's called The Biff World. So do you remember that movie Back to the Future?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So Back to the Future 2, we experience like this ideal future with like self-drying jackets and, like 80s cafe and whatever. And so Marty gets the almanac and he's going to bring it back to 1985 so that he can get his truck and finally get out of like lower middle class, working class existence. He comes back to the Biff world, which is kind of like Trump world.
Yeah.
Like it was like actually
you're totally right.
Yeah. Scarily predicting Trump. Like, Biff looks like Trump. He has the same hair. I think they were kind of riffing on Trump Tower a little bit. But in order to fix the Biff world, Marty has to go back to 1955, do the whole thing with whatever, but that actually will not fix it. Fate takes him back to 1885 in like the colonial West era. And so in order to fix the present, it's like, yes, we're going back and back and back. And if we don't want this particular future, we have to go back and back and back and restory and heal the past. So when I was researching this article that I was writing, there's this theory in quantum physics that actually the future determines the past because of quantum entanglement, which is something that it won the Nobel Prize in 2022. Essentially, like particles that are like on opposite ends of the universe, if they were entangled before, if they split like light years apart, if something happens to this particle, it will register over here. And so because of quantum entanglement, it puts into question the linear flow of time, right? So that means that if we want to heal the past, we can do it in the present, in the future. And like, I think scientists are like very, they like don't want to like sound woo like this, but I will do it because I'm a poet. But yeah, so like this quantum entanglement and this idea of, oh, what's it called? It's something, an entangled future. I don't know. I have the tab open somewhere. Yeah, essentially the future determines the past just as much as the past determines the future. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes total sense. I love what you're saying. Oh my God. No, my husband and I have been talking about one of the things that we need as like Americans is that we need a new collective story, because what is there now, it's a lot of lies. And then also it's just like, it's how do we move forward unless we can restory our past? So everything you're saying, I'm just like 100% on board with.
Here's a Vice article that I'm just linking for everyone, whoever wants to read it. But yeah, so a growing number of scientists are convinced the future influences the past. And so when I think about like what we're doing right now, right? So like we look at like the 1619 project, which goes all the way back to 1619 at the arrival of the first slave ship. And all of these suppressed stories, these silenced stories, have, the project is about like, gathering those narratives in order to, just give us a view of the past that does justice to the silences and erasures of, what happened to Black enslaved people in the United States, right? I think Get Out is this kind of restorying, right? Saidiya Hartman's work, Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments, right? This act of going into the archive and using like the sort of skeleton of the archive and filling in the humanity of, like the photo of a girl doing laundry in Harlem, let's say, or like, I think the future is literally changing the past, with these projects, with these kinds of books, with this kind of speculative storytelling. So the BIF world, I will get the courage to pitch it soon.
I hope so. I know. I'm not the only. Eliana Ruiz, who's in the chat, she said that's something she would read. I would absolutely read. I mean, your poet brain on anything. When we read these, I didn't fucking read anything you wrote, Vanessa, honestly. But the BIF world makes complete and utter sense to me. It just, no, you're right. And you talk about, you quote a linguist, and wait, I think I have.
Oh, yes, Naya Hill.
Yeah, and using, like, talking about language and the way that we have, view time in the language, and how there's indigenous languages and other languages that actually have, and I say time isn't linear all the time, but like sometimes you don't know what that means. And so you really gave us a very good example of that. And I think I have, hold on, let's see, boop. I mean, obviously that caught my imagination, because I was like, that is a good kind of concrete way to do it. Oh, yeah. So this is the question I had that included that. So I'll just segue to that. So this is, of course, the land, as you know, which is always on my brain all the time because I'm constantly trying to know the land more. And so in memory, a lacuna, where you're tracing your matrilineal line through the Catholic mission records, you write, land is the only record that remains. Then in the next paragraph, we all come from the land, eat from it, drink from it, touch its surfaces. The land is memory-made material. It is the first object ever to come into existence. Anything that exists after it is because of and part of the land. Therefore, its formations and materials, when interpreted, are undeniable. They trump false narratives, ice cores, tree rings, the amount of water left. These facts build up sequences a story. So I know that for me and for a lot of other people in different diasporas, we've been attempting to unerase our family lines, or even just our people's histories, as we were talking about, like 1619 Project is a really good example of that. But contending with our own family's silences, and not just silences that, I mean, the things that they won't talk about, the things that they want to suppress, but the things that like they don't know or that they don't know. Like one of the things about, I too also have PTSD. And one of the things my therapist told me he was like, I thought I had an anxiety disorder. I remember when I went to Sarah Lawrence, I took advantage of the free therapy. And he was like, I was like, I have got to have a severe anxiety disorder. And he was like, no, you have just been in trauma for so long since you were a young child. That because I had such bad memory problems. He said that the anxiety fulfilled, and I think you talk a little bit about this in your book too, it fills everything. It fills all the spaces, and you're so concerned with surviving, you can't remember. And I remember I would have friends just scream at me when I was a teenager because I couldn't remember conversations we had the day before. And it's like, and you think about like the things, and I remember like, and I've said this more than once to more than one therapist, there are things I don't remember that I don't want to remember. Like I had a very dark and violent childhood. And so like, I don't want to remember some of that shit, but what I do want to remember is stuff that like I'm having to constantly search for about my own family, and like where it goes back in Panama and Puerto Rico. And then my dad's adopted and also Mexico. And so that's like, that part's a blank slate, and that's okay with me. Like, I'm like, I don't need that. That's okay. I've lived that. But I think so I was thinking about the land. In terms of like recreation and finding memory, I wonder if there's another option, a way to journey back to our lands if possible, or instead research their native flora and fauna, their geologic formations, the rivers, the volcanoes, the oceans. I think about like my great grandfather came from Martinique to help build the Panama Canal, and there exists no record, and he was a self-taught engineer, but you cannot find any record of him in any, like, of course not, right? Like the Creole, and mulatto people who came to work and Black people who came to work on the canal. Nobody's gonna, not in Americans' history. So, but I know he's there, like through the stories of my family, I know. And he was a part of completely changing the formation of a land of Panama. I mean, that's like so powerful. And then he went on because he was the main engineer for most of Panama's development. And so he developed basically all of Panama's first infrastructure, for better or for worse. But that's like powerful, right? And I have to dig so hard. And it's only like when I can find a couple different records, but there's nothing, even though he was like in every administration, it's really hard to find any information about it. And I know that you had the same struggle with your own family. And I know that struggle is replicated in countless diaspora stories, right? So I'm like, how do we change our imagination, right? What do you think we're relying too much on the colonizers' methods of research, which will forever erase us? And based on your own research background, how can we reimagine our people's memories through the land, as well as create a new memory through the land we now live on?
I love that question. So I kind of try to tackle this in in the essay about AI, so which like seems so odd, because AI is like the opposite of the kind of memory we're talking about, like land memory, embodied memory. It's the reproduction of memory. Okay, am I going to go on a tangent? No, I can rein it in. Okay, so there's this book that I discuss in that essay, which looks at the video game Horizon Zero Dawn, Assassin's Creed Origins, as well as like Layli Long Soldier's poem Obligations 2 and Zong by M. Norbese Philip. No, I am going to go on a tangent. Okay, so, and also Humanimal by Banu Kapil. So M. Norbese Philip and Banu Kapil specifically address this issue of the limitations of the colonizers' methods of research is how you phrased it. Evidence, right? So the idea of the written word, the written record, is always produced by the system of domination, right? And so like for instance, with Banu Kapil's Humanimal, it's the story of two Bengali girls who were raised by wolves in the jungle, and then these British colonial doctors find them, and they try to make them human again, and so they have to like do surgeries on their extremities, because they were like supine, and so like just reset them so that they could stand up straight. They taught them language, they taught them how to read and write, and it was an extremely tragic story. Banu Kapil just felt like accessing the archive wasn't doing justice to these girls' stories, and so she took her research materials and her journals and she buried them in the earth and tried to just like absorb the sort of psychic energy. I hate to use those terms because they're so discredited as like femme woo language.
Not here. It's a safe space for all of those terms. Don't even worry about it.
But yeah, so to like absorb the psychic wound that the land remembered, right? And the land and its creatures. And she said that, or I think she wrote in, I think it was in Schizophrenia where she discussed this, just like a dream of oceans and this sort of like wolf dream that she experienced as like the kind of memory of the land when she dug up her journals again. M. Norbese Philip has a similar project in Zong where she takes the legal documents of the sinking of a slave ship, where the owners were trying to sue the insurance company to get money for their losses, but she wasn't interested in that. She was interested in excavating the voices of the enslaved that drowned with that ship. And so the document itself contains their voices, right, because it documents the sinking of the ship. But in order to access those voices, the words themselves, the linear structure of the legal document is not revealing them. So she had to start breaking up the syllables. And so you get these like guttural, just utterances, right? And she starts sort of arranging them and accessing this other language that is the document atomized, exploded, right? And so the voices that come through are like these watery, just, I don't know how to describe it, just like sounds from this fugue state of communing with the earth itself, with the memory of the ocean, the memory of the water. I'm going to link this poem by Layli Long Soldier, which I teach all the time, it says join the chat. I'll put it in private chat. To go back to that linguist you were talking about, Yasnaya Hil, and her book is only available in Spanish, so what I translated is there. But she talks about how in indigenous languages, time doesn't exist the way we have it here, right? So like when we think of the future, we think ahead. So that literal plane that we have made in language, which creates time as like a spatial thing right ahead, that is already like a colonial framing of time as linear and as something to be discovered, right? Because if it's ahead, then what is between you and the future is a field. And that field is like, you know, that's like a very colonial concept, right? And the way, and this is just from the book, the way Indigenous peoples thought of time was different, right? The examples that I cite in the book are the future comes down because it like is a surprise. And the past is in front of you because you're always thinking about your ancestors. You're always looking to elders for guidance. So the past is in front of you and the future is behind you. And, you know, and so like that reorienting of time is a language issue. It's a colonial language issue. Another is the Hopi peoples. It has been said, you know, according to the Sapir-Whorf theory, which is like, you know, discredited, whatever, but that they had a sense of time as a relative thing because they don't have tenses in their language, and the way that they arrange time in their language is just very similar to the theory of relativity, Einstein's theory of relativity, but it was just part of their common sense way of being in the world, way before Einstein created the proof, right, for the theory of relativity. And so I think like those examples that I use in that essay, the sort of power we can feel when we embrace these speculative methods of knowledge production, right? And so I think like recently on TikTok, like last year or a couple of years ago, there was like this like forager, this black forager who was just like starting to like learn how to forage for food around her, and became like really, really familiar with edible mushrooms, edible, you know, herbs. And it actually like led her to let's not say discover, right? But led her to reframe her relationship to nature, not as a thing that's separate from us, right? But like relearning plant names and uses according to like local indigenous knowledge. And all she did was just like take one step out her door and start being like, can I eat this? You know? And so, and like that is like the first step, I think, to like reframing what knowledge production is and what it can be. I think like knowledge production is so enshrined in the institution, credibility, credentials, you know, prestige, whatever. But there are ways out of it, because those systems are only leading us to AI, which is essentially just a consensus of everything we've ever done, but AI cannot imagine. It is not capable of imagining. Also, like, never trust a thing that uses the existing records of like Western colonial like cultural production, like, you know. So anyway, collective memory exists outside of AI. That is a language that it cannot assimilate. And collective memory, its natural form, the epic, right, is poetry. So like the way people used to remember things is through poetry, through rhyme, through just like epic stories. Poetry is a very embodied language. And so poetry is a language, it's a rebel language. AI cannot assimilate it, it cannot reproduce it. You can try. AI poetry is the worst poetry I've ever read.
So bad. It's so bad. I love the term you used in your book, which I think is so good, is it's insurgent language.
Yeah.
And I could not agree. I was just like, fuck yeah. This is it, when we talk about like, everybody's like, the poets are going to save us. And it's like, are we? And I was like, well, with shit like that, yes, we are. Well, because you think about like our bodies are the earth, and that's what we've disconnected from. And what you're talking about with the Black Forager is that, you know, so many of us suffer from plant blindness, which is an actual thing where you cannot see any of the living things around you. And it is, capitalism is all about that disconnection from the body. And that starts with the land. And that's exactly what you're talking about. It's like how you know, it wants to suppress that collective memory and has worked so hard for it. But if we allow ourselves to reconnect, to see, like even just walk, I say this to people all the time, walk outside your door, find one plant that's growing up from the concrete, find out what it is. Because honestly, it's badass that it's growing up from fucking concrete, you know? And that's like, that is so important, and I completely agree with everything you're saying. Okay, so I want to get to the chat question, and then I want to end on one other question, and then we'll let y'all go. So there's this is a good question too. What are the ethics of writing about our ancestors through a magical realism lens when we occupy liminal identities in spaces as Latinx?
That's a great question. I'm going to take it in pieces, if that's okay. First of all, what are the ethics of writing about our ancestors? Period. Like, you can stop there, right? One of the things that I came up against is that, and this is like a critique of like Chicanismo, right? When we think about our past, right? So like my family history stops at a hacienda, which is the site of detribalization. And so, you know, after like digging and talking to my tío Samuel, it turns out, you know, we are Yaqui. Of course, I can't claim that identity ethically, right? But it stops at the hacienda because that's where, forcible assimilation happened, let's say, right? Cultural genocide, actual genocide. And so when I try to imagine between those gaps, between the records that I know and that I have, that is a speculative space, but that also becomes a romanticized space. And that's how we get things like indigenismo, right? That's where we get things like Aslan and Chicanismo, these ways of romanticizing the past, our indigenous pasts, and as this act of reclamation, which only like feeds into and plays into like noble savage tropes and things like that. So is it ethical to write about our ancestors, period? How do we do so ethically as Latinas? Because we're going to have to touch on indigeneity, but that means we're also going to have to touch on our whiteness, right? We're going to have to touch on the violence of mestizaje. So that already is fraught. And I resent that pressure because, like, if someone wanted to write an ancestral history about their French ancestors, I just don't know that ethical tension exists, right? Because if I were to write my way back to the Yaqui, those narratives, I know that I would fuck it up, right? I would be unethical in some way in trying to reclaim and reconnect, right? So the desire is there. I'm just still trying to figure out how to do that ethically anyway. Okay, so now, how do we ethically write about our ancestors in magical realism or liminal terms as Latinas? Okay, so magical realism, the way we understand it as like a literary genre, I would say Pedro Páramo is like the first magical realism novel we have. Jorge Luis Borges, was the next sort of magical realism writer, and then those two influenced Gabo. Magical realism as part of the Latin boom was happening during a time of incredible colonial imperial violence in Latin America. extraction, the Panama Canal, like you were talking about, right? These incredibly violent convulsions of, imperial violence. And so I was talking earlier about like that reality break, right? Magical realism, I think, is my sort of thesis, I guess, is a way of writing your reality as it feels, as it is true, because it is the reality against empire, right? So whatever empire says reality is, magical realism exists in a state of grief, exists in a state of loss, of estrangement, of desire, and so the genre itself comes from this break of reality, right? So like what colonized people experience, and then what the narrative is, the official narrative. So I think maybe magical realism might be the only ethical way, right? Because if I were to write realism, I am participating in a narrative world-building project that is Western, right? Like, I feel like domestic realism as a genre, right, is the story of what it is to be a first world person living in America, living in empire. And I really question what those narratives are, what they mean, what they leave out. Why is domestic realism focused on the family, the individual, psychological realism, and not like the collective, right? And so magical realism, it's about these like families where everyone is named Aurelio, these generational stories, these collective stories, and reality is breaking all the time, because that's what it means to live in a post-colonial reality. It's not reality, it's irreality. So what are the ethics of that? I think I've just walked through my sort of ethics process. And you're like, I invite us all to like create that poetics for ourselves. Is it ethical to write magical realism as a Latina today? Yeah, I don't know. But that's my analysis, at least. I hope I answered the question.
It's a very good analysis. I think it's a great answer. And then I think like I wish we had more time, and then we could talk about Ingrid's book, because I feel like The Man Who Moved Clouds really like blew up that entire right. I know, Vanessa, be my friend so we can just talk about this stuff, because I also have 1,000 science article tabs open. Yes, that book is like, I know. That was like your book. I feel is absolutely in conversation with that book, which is also just like I think pivotal for like just everything, honestly. All right, well, we're gonna end on the river because it is the year of the dragon in Chinese astrology, and so Alice Sparkly Cat, I don't know, are you yeah. I feel like you follow Alice Sparkly Cat. Okay, when Alice Sparkly Cat wrote about in December, like the upcoming year and what 2024 is going to be the year of the dragon, and talked about how dragons are rivers, and then also talked about like imagination, Jupiter, and like it's a great post. People should look it up. But Alice Sparkly Cat wrote, "Every single dragon is unique. Every single dragon has given birth to a multitude of unique cultures. Every single slang word, song, and humor or style arises in relation to the rhythm of some dragon. Every single culture has been shaped by fresh water. We are all children of dragons. If you have any culture in you, that culture came from some dragon out there. Get to know that dragon, know its many names, understand your own why. Why do you tend to believe certain things are possible and other things to be impossible? It has to do with the behavior of some river." So again, so much of this book this amazing book that you wrote has been shaped by your origin point, which is the Rio Grande Valley, where the Rio Grande is the focal point. That's my river too. That is the river that runs through my community in Albuquerque that we live and die on. So I love that we share that. But I think about it all the time, especially like last year, it dried up and where it crossed over in Albuquerque. And that was so traumatic, and it had done that. It does that a couple times. But like, I'd love to hear how the river has shaped you, your family, the culture of your people. As Alice asks, why do you tend to believe certain things are possible and other things to be impossible? And this question is such a good frame for your entire book. So I just wanted to hear your final thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I'm from the Rio Grande Valley, El Valle. That's where I was born. But my mother and my grandmother, and this is in the essay Memory of Lacuna, they were born in La Comarca de la Laguna, which is Torreon, Durango, that area. And it's where these two rivers, so rivers, as we know, they empty into the sea. But these rivers in particular, they're between the Sierra Madre Oriental and Occidental. And so the mountains redirect these rivers to empty into the land. And in the rainy season, those rivers flood and they make a lake. And so that's how it sustained life for centuries, indigenous life for centuries, until the Spaniards came and saw land that was very fertile where they could plant cotton and, what are the other crops. So La Comarca de la Laguna became a site for haciendas, right? And for indigenous erasure. And I remember thinking, the river's drying up, right? That is the literal erasure of memory, because Toni Morrison says about the Mississippi River, she says they tried to straighten the river, over the years, but the Mississippi River would remember its original path. And that's what imagining is. That's what writing is. That's what remembering is. It's, flooding. It is literally flooding. It's the land remembering. And as I was writing this essay, I found this article where they'd opened the dams and those rivers flooded again. And so the land remembered again. And lakes and rivers have these, they're really, really deeply rooted symbols. I'm really interested in the idea of a collective unconscious and how symbols work, right? Lakes, when my mom is forgetful, she's like, ando bien lagunas, which means my mind is a lake, I guess, is what it means. But she just means she's being very forgetful at that moment. And so I don't know. I hope I'm answering your question. If we're talking about rivers, if we're talking about land, if we're talking about flooding, I think memory is how we sort of flood our inner land. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Connecting back to that Toni Morrison quote, if the river remembers its original path by flooding, if the rivers in the Comarca de la Laguna remember their original sort of lake formation at their most fertile, then our most fertile is when we allow ourselves to remember, not just from our memories, but embodied memory, right? And that is a speculative memory.
Yeah.
I hope that made sense. It makes sense to me.
It makes total sense. Anything that you had to say on the subject was going to be amazing. I feel like we're so obsessed with right answers, right? Or answering the specific question. But part of what you do is you break through those expectations because they're, they tie us down and force us into places that, like you, everything that you do, right, Vanessa, is the act of decolonization. You know, I'm always asking, you know, I interview a lot of poets like for different publications, and like, and then one of the things I'm always asking them is like, how do you define decolonization, right? And what I love about you is because this book absolutely is an, you know, that definition of decolonization, but all you do, all you say, you know, the poetry you write, like you are that living definition. And I am so profoundly grateful that we got the chance to even just talk a little bit about all of these amazing topics. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who joined us.
Yes,
thank you to the Word.
Much.
So much love for everybody.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone who came. This has been a blast.
This has been so incredible. I could listen to you both talk forever. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who watched. Please, you will be getting an email probably tomorrow that will have a link to this video, as well as a little survey to just get some feedback on how you felt about this event, as well as any other events you'd like to see going forward. We build all of our programming by community, so we really appreciate any feedback you have. I know I mentioned stuff earlier in the beginning of events, but I just want to remind you, our editor-writer mentorship program is now open, and applications close August 4th. So writers with complete unpublished manuscripts are welcome to apply. And we also have our Margins Literary Conference and Book Festival coming up in September. Please go to our website. Tickets are on sale now. And we also have a couple other Margins book selling events happening this month. One next week, which is going to be our BIPOC Bookseller Award celebration and discussion of book selling as culture work, which will feature our 2023 winners. And then a very special collaborative teach-in with I Stand With Immigrants, in which we will discuss storytelling and solidarity on July 25th. So much more to come. Thank you all so much for staying with us this evening. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.